Hi everyone, welcome to Como Live. I'm Bryn, I'm a horticulturist here at the Marjorie McNeely Conservatory, and I work mostly with the orchids. So today I'm going to show you how to mount an epiphytic orchid on a piece of cork bark. So I'll talk a little bit about which plants are good candidates for that type of growing, some of the materials that you might want to use, and kind of just some overall how-to. And hopefully maybe it'll inspire you to try something with one of your collection plants at home, or maybe it'll just give you some insight on how we care for tropical plants out of their native habitat. So one of the first things to consider about mounting something or growing it epiphytically, and this sounds kind of like a no-brainer, is the plant epiphytic in the wild? So would it be growing on the surface of another plant, or some plants are considered lithophytic, or growing on the surface of a stone. So is it something that would normally grow with its roots exposed? And that just that tells you that the plant already kind of has the adaptations in its root structure and its growth habit that would really lend itself to kind of growing in that manner. If it's a plant that normally would be growing in soil or other media, then you're going to kind of be challenged to overcome some of those adaptations to grow that way. So the plant that I chose today is an orchid from our Neotropical Orchid collection, and a lot of tropical orchids would naturally be epiphytes. Most of the time though, you're probably going to say, if you've ever visited us, you know that we grow a lot of our orchids in kind of generic plastic pots. And that's mostly because in general, it's a little bit more practical for a lot of orchids. Even though they would naturally be growing with their roots a little more exposed, the container sort of lets you create sort of a tropical microclimate. It lets you regulate the humidity a little bit better. It stabilizes the plant, which is really important. So for a lot of growers like us, or even homeowners, containers can be really practical. And just because something naturally would be an epiphyte doesn't mean you wouldn't have success with it in a container. But the plant I picked, typically, and you can kind of see it has a linear growth habit. This had been in this container, and I pulled it out ahead of time just to sort of see what we were getting into. Since these plants tend to sprawl, they're good candidates to be mounted. There's one behind me that is a different species, but the same genus, and you can see how big they get. They like to be sort of rangy and wrap themselves around their mount. In the wild, they would be growing around probably tree trunks and branches in parts of sort of southern Central America and northern South America. So they're going to need space to kind of spread out, and a little round pot like this doesn't necessarily accommodate that. When the orchid is small like this one, you can get by with a container, but eventually I want my plant to be a specimen size like the one behind me. So I'm going to transition it to this piece of cork right now. And the reason we use cork is, as you can imagine from maybe wine corks or corkboard that you've experienced, cork's really nice and light. So for hanging something up, if you need a big surface area, it's relatively light for the amount of area that it gives the plant. It also doesn't tend to rot very quickly, which is a plus because we need to water these about every other day. So it needs to be tolerant, the material you use needs to be tolerant of being wet a lot of the time. Some other choices for materials are, this is a cedar slatted slab, which is sort of hard to say. But this is really nice because again, the cedar is sort of rot resistant, and the structure provides some nooks and crannies for the roots to kind of grow through and hold on to. And these are nice manageable sizes and easy to purchase. Another item we sometimes use, this is a section of tree fern trunk. So you can see this is kind of interesting. It has really nice kind of porous structure. And again, that provides a lot of spaces for the roots to grow into, because the roots are going to need to be able to adhere to whatever surface you're applying them to. So if it has a little bit of texture, that's a really good thing. And these are nice too. I've noticed some of our orchids will actually grow all the way through. You'll see roots coming out the back of the tree fern. So the roots will find their way all the way through this material, and that's kind of nice too. And it's also, again, it's pretty lightweight. And I pulled out a piece of driftwood too. Some folks like to use driftwood because it has a really natural appearance. And again, it still has some texture to it. It could be a little bit heavier depending on the size piece you chose or depending what type of wood it was. But it is a little bit more attractive maybe in some ways than some of the other items. The couple that are sitting here on the table, this is just a cedar shingle. That's something you could pick up at a home improvement store, and that's really nice again for the rot resistance, and it's relatively lightweight, and the size is nice. So for a smaller plant like this, that works really well. And then the one a little bit closer to me here, this one is on a more natural mount too. This is a cedar tree branch, not driftwood, but also a little bit more natural looking. So those are just some examples of some of the materials that you might want to use. The cork bark is good for this because, again, this is going to sprawl, so I want to give it some space, and this has a nice flat kind of spread out surface for that, and that's the plant's natural habit. So some of the same rules with mounting a plant would apply to repotting. What you want to look for is brand new growth. This has some nice new roots started, which is really important. That means that the plant is sort of ready to start reestablishing. So if you're pulling it out, as you can see, I took it all the way out of the media. I pulled off as much of the old bark as I could, and I'm going to cut off some of these old roots. So you really want the plant to be ready to reestablish where you're putting it. Sometimes if you time this poorly, the plant can struggle to really establish itself on its new surface or its new pot if you're just repotting. So what I'm going to do is, back here you can see we talked about the linear growth habit. These are the old pseudobulbs. These are just storage structures for the plants, and adaptation to store water and a little bit of energy in case the plant has to withstand a drought or something like that. So since this one is shriveled and yellow, the plant's not using it anymore. So I'm going to cut that off along the stem, if you can see what I'm doing, and take that off. The plant's not going to use that part. You may notice too on a plant like this, under the older bulbs, these are nice and green, they're perfectly healthy. I'm going to leave those on there. But these roots are a little bit older. Again, the plant's not using these, so we can take these out because they're not really that important right now. And the way to tell if roots are really functional or not, because some of these are sort of discolored, and that can just be stains from the media. They might be healthy roots, but they might just have sort of an odd color. The freshest roots are pretty white or sort of cream colored. Maybe the brand new growth has sort of a green or pink tinge to it. Those are obviously really healthy roots. The ones below, these are also healthy roots too, but they're just a little older. I'm going to leave these because there's absolutely nothing wrong with those. The plant's still using those. But this is an example here. You can see how some of these roots are sort of sloughing apart. They're definitely discolored. If you pinch them, I know you guys can't maybe see this that well, but when you pinch them between your fingers, they'll sort of collapse. Usually a healthy root feels a little bit more rigid, like a wire. These definitely feel sort of squishy. So the tissue in there just isn't that functional anymore. So we're going to take some of these out and get it pretty cleaned up. And again, just kind of judging which ones are helpful or not. If you leave some roots that are old, it is not the end of the world. Because if you look at the ones behind me, or even the examples that are sitting here on the table, you can see that some of those roots underneath are older, and that is naturally how the plant would grow. Some orchids tend to sort of grow just on top of themselves, and they end up growing over their old tissue, and it's not a problem. That's what they would naturally do. So you don't have to be overly strict about removing every last thing. It's just a good idea when you have a plant out of its container, or if you're redoing a mount, to get rid of anything that's basically not useful to the plant, because if it's just sitting there not doing any good, it's just going to rot. So it's an opportunity to clean it up a little bit. And this looks pretty good. Maybe just get those out of there. So I like that, and like I said, these are sort of a little bit weird looking, but these are healthy roots. So I'm going to keep those even though they're sort of long. And as I said, these would naturally grow around tree trunks and probably wouldn't have a lot of substrate with them. What I like to tell people about orchids, or really any plant that you're going to try to grow in your house, or a plant that you're taking out of its natural habitat, just consider what its natural habitat is and see if you can adapt your conditions to that, whether it's your house or your yard, whatever you're doing. So in this case, this plant wants to have its roots relatively exposed. It doesn't want to have a lot of extra extra media or extra moisture there. You may have noticed, even though I just pulled this out of a pot that's a few inches deep, the roots didn't really extend that far into the media. That's a sign of a plant that's not really using the entire profile of the pot. It's most of its roots were near the surface, probably where it was a little bit drier, and that's the natural habit of this plant, to have relatively shallow, sort of sprawling roots. For plants that like a little bit more moisture, sometimes we'll add a little bit of sphagnum to our mounts, or if it's something that you think might dry out a little bit quickly, or a particularly little plant, that can be sort of helpful to sort of get it started and give the roots something to kind of sink into right away. But in this case, I feel pretty good about just attaching this plant with no other substrate than the cork. I often use just regular monofilament fish line. And what I like about this is it's not very obvious. So it doesn't really show up. If you look closely, like in the cases of these orchids, you may see some fish line. In this case, I used a little bit of aluminum wire. The aluminum's nice because it doesn't rust. But it shows a little bit more. Eventually, whatever you're using to mount your plant, whatever you're using to attach it, is going to sort of become superfluous. The plant is going to attach on its own with its own roots. So at some point, at least the goal is that it won't be relying on whatever you're using. I've seen folks use things like pantyhose, which are sort of ugly, but they're really soft, which is nice if you have a softer bodied plant and you're worried that whatever you're tying with might cut into the tissue. This has a really rigid stem. I'm not worried about the fishing line sort of sinking into it. It should be just fine. So what I'm going to do is just carefully wrap around. I'm holding the one side underneath with my right hand, and I'm going to kind of weave in between the pseudobulbs here and just go across that stem. I am trying to be a little bit mindful of those brand new roots at the front. So when the roots get to be about an inch or so long, like those brand new ones at the front, they can be a little bit brittle. So it's sort of important to be aware that you may need to be a little bit careful of those. So now I've wrapped it around pretty snugly. Like I said, I'm not worried about the fishing line cutting into the plant. Sorry, I keep moving it around. But to kind of test it out, it's pretty stable if I wiggle it. And that's really important. Orchids, whether they're in their containers or mounted, need to be pretty stable, or you can risk breaking some of the roots if those new roots I was just talking about that are sort of brittle, if they wiggle around too much on a mount or in a container, sometimes those roots can get broken. And they tend to have trouble establishing if they're not very stable. So in this case, you can see now I turn it vertical, it doesn't move at all. So this should be in good shape like this. I'm gonna kind of rest it on the container, maybe. This is always the awkward part. Sometimes it feels like you need an extra hand. And I'm just gonna tie a knot in the back where it's sort of inconspicuous, hopefully. And it's a little tricky, but usually what's nice about the monofilament too is it stretches a little bit. So there's some give in it over the plant. I almost lost the end. Get my finger out of there. Like I said, you feel like you need another hand. Okay, that should be good. So now we have it pretty well attached. I may shore that up a little bit because it is a little bit loose. Like I said, eventually it won't matter because these roots will adhere to the cork, wrap themselves around, and it won't be a big deal. But I do want it to establish well. So I may put some fish line going a different direction to sort of get like a crisscross effect. Another thing I've used and had some success with too, I'll show you, are these floral pins. They look like little staples. And those can be nice for plants that are a little bit smaller, as long as the material that you're mounting them to is soft enough that you can bury this in it. I wouldn't try to drive this into solid wood or something like that, but I have been able to press it into pieces of cork. You could probably place it over a stem like this, or kind of across some of the pseudobulbs, and that's another way to get them sort of stable right away, or to help hold the plant while you're trying to tie whatever you're whatever you're using to tie the plant to the mount with. So that's one way to kind of, like I said, give yourself an extra hand. Use something else to attach it sort of temporarily, and then wrap whatever your mounting material is around it. So that's basically the gist of it. Hopefully you all learned something today, or just enjoyed watching me putz around with this orchid. Thank you guys for watching.